Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Penn Vicarage on this Monday morning. Nice to see you. I hope you had a lovely weekend. We certainly did. Some great week services in church. Great to be together in the house of God. And whatever you did this weekend, I hope it was good for you. Friends, we are getting towards the back end now of Matthew's Gospel. Remind you of the scene. It's been a long weekend, hasn't it? To remind you of the scene, Jesus is in Jerusalem. He's been living at Bethany, but commuting in each day. He's had various confrontations and so on with the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians, and various people. And we're now in chapter 25. And this morning is the famous parable of the talents. So without further ado, it's Matthew chapter 25, starting to read at verse 14. Jesus said, "For it's as if a man, going on a journey, summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. And he went away. The man who had received the 5 talents went off at once and traded with them and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who received the 1 talent went off, dug his hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. And the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, receiving 5 talents more, saying, 'Master, you handed to me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more talents.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and trusty slave. You've been trustworthy in a few things. I'll give you charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master.' And the one with the 2 talents also came forward, saying, 'Master, you handed over to me 2 talents. See, I've made 2 more talents.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You've been trustworthy in a few things. I'll put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master.' And the one who received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, 'Master, I knew you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid and went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, have what is yours.' But his master replied, 'You wicked and lazy slave. You knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return would have received what was mine with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to the one with the 10 talents. For to all who have, more will be given, and they'll have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into outer darkness, where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth.' This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God." Right, what's this passage about? Well, I think you can take it basically at 3 levels, getting better each time. On the first level, it sounds to me like a sort of recipe for capitalism, really. It's those who invested their money and who didn't. Some who invested wisely and made a return and so on. And he says those who have more, what they have will be given more, and those who have little, even what they have will be taken away. And it all sounds a bit harsh. But on the face of it, it sounds like a suggestion we should invest our money. But I think there's a problem here. It's not very Jesus-esque, but also because at the end, when the master comes back and the man with the 1 talent says, "I'll bury it in the ground," and the master says, "You should have put it to the bankers and I'd have had interest on it." What you may or may not know is that the gaining of usury or the gaining of interest was strictly forbidden in the Old Testament. I think there's a bit of a clue here that that's not really what Jesus means it to be. It's not really meant to be a recipe for making sure you invest money and all that sort of stuff. I think it's rather deeper than that. I don't really actually think it's particularly about money. So, we'll take it to the next level. It's also been suggested that the word talent is quite interesting, that we've been given 5 talents and someone else 2 talents, and one person 1 talent. And talent is an interesting phrase, isn't it? I mean, we tend to think of people who are talented as in gifted and talented, don't we? And it is true to say that we've all been given gifts and talents from God. And so many sermons have been preached to the effect that you should use what God has given you. And quite right, and they'd be right to preach that. So if God has given you the gift to make a very nice cup of tea, then make lots of nice cups of tea. If God has given you the gift of being able to speak his word, then speak his word. If God's given you the opportunity to, serve practically or be an accountant or whatever, then whatever gift or talent God has given you, you should use it for God's glory. And it's quite right that we should. And in some sense, I think that's absolutely right. We all have talents. Some may be more obvious than others. But we all have, given that God's given us all talents, we've got a responsibility to use them. So I think that's a perfectly good illustration of the passage. Jesus talks about one person having 5 talents, one person having 2, one person having 1. And the people who are praised by the master, who is clearly supposed to be God, are the ones that use the talents that they've been given. So the story goes, as I say, we are supposed to use the gifts and talents that God's given us. And I think that's true. I think that's a perfectly valid, reasonable interpretation of the text. But I think it's actually somewhat deeper than that. Because even at that level, it seems a little unfair. I mean, the poor guy with 1 talent, he didn't really stand. On face of it, it doesn't sound like he had much of a chance from the off. But I think it is about using talents. But I think what we need to go beyond that and ask ourselves what's behind it. And I think the real key is actually, and I think this is what the true interpretation is really, is on the man with the 1 talent. Why didn't he go out and do what the other 2 did? Because he says to his master, because I know you to be a harsh man. Because he says, I know you where you reap where you do not sow, and so on and so on and so on. And because of that, he says, I was scared. And because I was scared, I hid my money in the ground. And I think that is where the man went wrong. Because I think he had a bad view of his master. The other 2 felt they could invest and use the gifts they'd been given because they thought their master was all right, and because they weren't frightened of him. Because they weren't frightened, they were able to live life expansively and use the gifts that they'd been given. Because this 3rd man had it in his head that that the master was nasty, that he reaped where he had not sown, and he was a harsh man, because he was frightened. And it's because he was frightened that he didn't do it. And I think that is the key. And the master says, I think, in almost a degree of sarcasm, you knew, did I, that I'm a man a harsh man, and so on. And there's, I think, there's quite an air of sarcasm in there as well. If that's what you think of me, then, and so on. And I think the key to this passage is really about the 3rd man had a bad view of the master. And because he was frightened of the master, that's why he felt he couldn't use the gifts he'd been given. And I think there's an absolute massive, fantastic and vital message for us here today. I've said many times, I don't believe Jesus came to show us that there's a God. I think he kind of assumed that. I think Jesus came actually to show us what God is like. I think Jesus came to show us that God is good. And because God is good, because God is forgiving, because God is loving, because God is kind, we do not need to be terrified of him. And because we don't have to be terrified of God, we can live life to the full, and we can use the gifts that God's given us. But if we're constantly worried that this nasty master's looking over our shoulders and trying to pick us up and spoil us at spoil at every possible turn, then we're not going to live life full, are we? Because we're going to be frightened, and like the guy with the 1 talent here. So I think the key to this passage is really on the way the slaves saw the master. And I think the same is true for us today. I think the key is the way we see God. If we see God as frightening, spoil sport, terrifying, looking over our shoulders, looking to trip us up at every opportunity, then of course we'll be careful. Of course we won't use the gifts God's given us because we're looking over our shoulder all the time. But if, like Jesus showed us, that God is good, that God is kind, loving and forgiving, because we'll know that the everlasting arms of love around us, because we know that he's there to protect us and forgive us and love us. Therefore, we can live life to the full. What did Jesus say? I came that I may have life, and life in all its fullness. And knowing God is good, that's exactly what we can do. So like the guys with the 5 talents and the 2 talents, we know our master, our God is good, and therefore we can serve him with freedom. If we're like the 1 talented man and we're terrified of God, then we won't. So the battle and message this morning is, let's see God and remember that God is good. And that's why live life confidently.